Welcome to Pub and Porch, Applied Stoicism in Modern Life, hosted by Adam Piercy and Mick Mulroy. Okay, we are back with Mick and Adam. Mick, good to have you again.
Absolutely.
So today we had talked about wanting to cover the topic of the Republic, and this idea of sort of a model society or a model government or a model city. Um, I think the Greeks would have probably called it a model polis in the sense of like that city state idea probably. The most famous of the republics that we um, usually hear about is the seminal work written by Plato, who was a student of Socrates. But I think today we were also wanting to talk a little bit about someone's other opinion on the republic, which was Zeno, who was the founder of Stoicism. So, Mick, Zeno, my original understanding of the story is Zeno loses his fortune, washes up on the shores of Athens, and then needs to or wants to find his way and then kind of goes from there. Is that a right sort of starting point for us?
I think so. And I have to say that this last summer we were was it summer? Yeah, it was summer. We were doing a maritime corridor of food delivery into Gaza, and we did it from Cyprus. And so we stayed in Cyprus in this port town of Larnaca for many months. And when I first got there, of course, I'm like, huh, so Zeno's from Cyprus. I wonder where Citium is. That's the town he was from, or the village, I should say. So I'm running down the beach, and I got done with my run, and there was an old fellow standing there, and I just asked him. I said, "Hey, do you know where um, Citium is?" And he said, "Yes, I do." I said, "Because I'm looking for the town of Zeno." And he says, "He's looking at you right now." I'm like, "What? Is this supposed to be some kind of philosophical thing?" And then he turned around and pointed, and there was a statue of Zeno right there. So Larnaca is the modern Citium. I found out at that second, and that is where he's from. And now it's a pretty big port town, but the ancient city of his birth is still there and preserved as you expect. So if you're ever looking to go visit Cyprus, it is in Larnaca, and that's worth visiting. And the statue is out in the regular town right there, and it is obviously Zeno. You'll recognize him immediately. But you're right. My understanding, and my father told me this story as a kid, so if it's embellished, I'm not going to change it. He was, he had most of his belongings with him when he went down in a shipwreck. Swam to shore with nothing but a cloak on. Went up to what in Piraeus, which is the port city of Athens, with nothing but a cloak, and went into what they would call a bookstore, and then heard somebody reciting um, what would have been probably Plato, right? Talking about Socrates, but the point being, talking about Socrates, and then Zeno said, "Where do we find such men?" Which I'm told is where we get that expression, right? And then the bookkeep pointed to one of Socrates' students that happened to be walking past the bookstore and basically said, "Follow him." And that's how it started. That's how Zeno went to Athens, started following, who was it? Crates, who was a cynic. I started off as a cynic, then
Yeah.
was a student in the uh, at Plato's Academy, was a student in the Megarian school, but eventually founded his own philosophy, which is Stoicism, and that's
Yeah.
if Socrates is the godfather of Stoicism, he's Zeno's the father.
I think there's an interesting line in the story of Zeno as well that later on, after he founds the school and people start um, practicing it and grows in popularity, they're looking for a name for themselves, is my understanding. And I know Ryan Holiday talks about this in his book, The Lives of the Stoics, where the story goes that the Stoics were thinking about calling themselves Zenoans or Zenoics or something like that, right? And there's a real sort of humility to this, like that I to me is almost like, Cincinnatus, where, yes, there's this big proud name for this, but ultimately instead of choosing to be followers of stardom, or followers of celebrity, they want to stick to the practice. So it's one of those things that I find interesting, because if people are practicing certain types of scientific methods, they might say it's Socratic, for example, or if someone's practicing, something, it might be Aristotelian logic or something like that. But um, in our world, interestingly, Zeno is not the name for that. He instead he founds it and then builds this concept out, and then we get Stoicism as a non-celebrity name. It's not a doesn't come with that proud name.
Yeah, and he part of what we, or at least I consider to be a Stoic traits, comes originally from how Zeno acted. He was very humble. Uh,
Hmm.
he lived moderately. He um, was very laconic in speech. I think Donald just wrote something about this, but laconic
Hmm.
Spartan, right? The
Yeah.
Spartans. They actually call themselves Laconians because they were from Laconia. Not, I mean, Sparta was just a town. But the point being is they spoke with brevity. They said a lot with a little,
Yeah.
and Zeno was known for that. And I think a lot of the way we try to model our behavior comes from Zeno. But again, like you said, not a celebrity, not based on a personality. It is the people's philosophy. In order, it's owned by everyone or no one.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting concept that you sort of find running through not just this philosophy, but in sort of the outward worldview as well. Of like, we are not singular individuals. We're sort of there's a wider. I don't know if I'd call it a greater good, but I definitely get the sense of you can't think of yourself as an island in this one.
Real.
So
And I would be
so
remiss without telling people, since it's part of the Zeno story. It was at the painted porch in the agora around Athens. Which the last time I was there for a Stoic conference, I lived in Athens for a couple years, and one of my favorite. I might have told you this already. My favorite place is James Joyce, and it turns out that the James Joyce is literally feet from the excavation of the Stoa Polkai, uh, the painted port.
yeah.
If you're
Oh
looking for a pilgrimage as a Stoic, that's it. You can get a pint, and you're literally, and they have an outside area. You're literally looking straight down on the porch itself, which is being uncovered right now.
yeah. Oh well, that's really cool. I think you have mentioned that, so that's a good reminder for people, though, of good places to check out. We do sometimes do pilgrimages to these places, which I think some people think is sort of an odd thing for a philosophy, but it's true. We do have that ability. So one of the things that runs through the time period of Socrates, Plato, Zeno, that there's a it's a long stretch of time, but one of the things that runs through that is sort of this idea of this republic, though, right? So Plato writes this republic as this work called The Republic, excuse me, as a work on political theory and philosophy. It includes topics about the state, justice, the relationship between the individual and the state, for example. And when most people talk about Greco-Roman philosophy, the Republic, I think, comes up a lot because it's a very important piece. But something that I actually kind of only knew a little bit about and then found out later was that Zeno had written a direct response to that, where he was basically writing a response in opposition to the book. And it's interesting to me to kind of think that you sort of had dueling philosophers in this time period, back in the day. So, but we should probably start by taking a little bit of a step back first, and maybe giving a little more background on this environment that this is happening in. So, Plato writes the Republic, Mick. Like, what is a key thing that he does with that?
So I think he wrote it around 370 BC, 375 BC. And you mentioned already, I mean, many philosophers. I think a famous quote that you was Whitehead, who said essentially every Western philosophy is a footnote to the Republic, right? So that kind of was the milestone. I learned a lot in the allegories that come from it, like the cave and the ring of Gyges, for example. But as you said, it's a political philosophy book above all, I think. And it really does talk about it doesn't necessarily promote one above the other, but it talks about, an oligarchy, a teamography, uh, what we call an autocracy. And it does somewhat promote the idea that the best, and democracy, of course, and democracy came about at the same time in Athens as Plato's Republic and then Zeno's Republic. But it also kind of promoted the idea that the most ideal part of society would be a benevolent dictator. To be frank, right? He talks about the philosopher king. He talks about the guardians. Uh, so it all promotes an elite in society that gets the education and that governs the people, and then the others would be these producers that essentially exist to promote the state, the guardians, and of course the philosopher king. And some would say that Aurelius represented the one epitome of what Plato was calling the philosopher king. But others would also say that that's essentially a benevolent dictatorship. And I think what Zeno was getting at is kind of flipping that on its head. The idea that society, which is still a pretty modern, even today, idea that society exists for the people. So, kind of inversion of that, something that was epitomized by John Locke later, and then, of course, obviously, and well, obvious for an American, in the Declaration of Independence in the United States. This idea that the government exists to promote the well-being of the people, not the people to promote the well-being of the governed. So when I first started reading, and it doesn't survive intact, but there's many references to Zeno's Republic later, and I wrote a paper called "The Tale of Two Republics" for Plato's Academy on it. It's really an advanced, even today, um, concept. It has complete gender equality. It has, again, the concept that the people, or the governed are for the people, for the goodwill of the people. It has the very stoic concept of the universal citizen, cosmopolitanism, where it is you are a person of the world regardless of whether you are wealthy or not, or what race or ethnic group or gender or religion. It really, now some would say it's so aspirational that it won't be attained, and maybe that's accurate. But the point being is, if you were trying to attain it, at least in my opinion, you'd be a better society. And it's if most people are familiar, obviously, with Plato's Republic. If you're not, even if you don't want to be a Stoic or you're just interested in history, strongly suggest that you take the time to read about uh, Zeno's version of the ideal republic, which is much more modern in scope, certainly for something that was written, thousands of years ago.
Yeah, so looking at Zeno's Republic and some of these ideals that are kind of being promoted, um, you know, he talks about society. I think spiritualism is a key topic that you mentioned in your piece, right? I'm going to reference that just because it's a good reference point for people. Service as well, though. So, but the thing is like, it's always more. How do I put it? Fantastical, not fantastical. It's better me. It's better for the news cycle, I guess you could say, if you always talk about ways in which the is Plato and Zeno are arguing with each other, that they're at odds with each other. When in reality, there are a lot of times there's things that are similar, right? But so I guess one thing we should make sure we say is that there's probably some stuff that they agreed on. This wasn't. I don't think this was a true duel, as I said it earlier. It's more that this was sort of a debate. What would you take it as, Mick? Like, or do you think that Zeno's really strong and it is more of a duel where they're literally dueling it out? duking it out through their writings. What do you think? Is it something more passive, or is it something a little stronger than that?
So it might have been a little stronger from Zeno's perspective, right? He was responding to it decades after. Um, but yes, I mean, I think it's important to point out we highlight the differences, right? Because the similarities aren't as interesting, perhaps. But I think there's obviously a lot of, when it comes to the way uh, Plato thought of virtue, ethics, logic, obviously the pursuit of science, were all very similar. But I do think there is a stark difference. I mean, if you look at, you mentioned spirituality, there's a concept in Plato's Republic called the noble eye, which, to my understanding, and if we have uh, professors in our audience, please correct me, but um, it's been my understanding for a long time that the noble eye was essentially that you would use religion and therefore your own divinity as a reason to tell the masses why you're in charge, right? So um, emperors and kings and have always, or seem to have always, claimed some kind of divinity, as in that's why they get to lead the rest of us, and it should be unquestioned. Whereas Stoicism believed in a universal God, right? So the concept of, God isn't the watch maker, God's the watch. So it's everything. So very, in some ways, Eastern in view. So, but it certainly wasn't, at least in anything I've read about Zeno's Republic, religion wasn't something to be used for your political in-state as manipulation. Where I'm not saying that Plato promoted that, but he certainly did discuss that as a concept to be used uh, by the governing body to claim, some kind of authenticity to be the leader itself. And there wasn't. It was somewhat of an immutable class, right? Guardians essentially bred with other guardians. There was really advanced concepts of, collective marriages and stuff like that in Plato's Republic, but essentially it was somewhat like it was a class system that didn't change. The producers stayed the producers, whereas in a more egalitarian view of Zeno's Republic, everybody was educated, including, all genders and races and groups. So could be a leader, could be part of the governing class, based primarily on, at least how I viewed it, as a meritocracy, and not something that was immutable based on what class you were born into.
Yeah, and when I think about the differences between the two republics, sometimes I come to the word to a single word that you could kind of use to describe it. Like Plato sort of says that um, you know, basically ruling can only, and that's the word I'm going to stick to on maybe the difference there. Ruling can only be done by one group, right? As opposed to um, I'm going to use the word ruling, although ruling is more autocratic, right? But I think ruling can be done by anyone, right? And I think that that's an interesting difference between the two. In Stoicism, the term justice, right, is not just about criminal justice in a courtroom. It's uh, that justice includes, magnanimity for other people, benevolence to for those around us, and all of those things. And I think that there's this Stoic concept of cosmopolitanism you cited in your article, and that resonates with me from our practice, right? Where it's not an only. It's an any, right? It's this wider net of like, well, who is right for doing this? Not only these people can do it, but who's the right one to do it, and focusing it in that way. And I think Zeno's stance on that, being that uh, it's definitely about that sort of wider net, and allowing all citizens to share those common rights and privilege, and participate in that sequence of events, or in those actions, is I think a very stark contrast. You're right. And anyways, that's my take on it. I think it's an interesting thing because I believe in a meritocracy as well. The democratic values that we in the West have, I think, come from the idea that anyone can do the work, learn the thing, be better at it, be good at it, and do it right. So
Yeah, absolutely. And another big proponent, or another thing it really promotes in Zeno's Republic is service.
yeah,
Essentially, that it's not just a nice thing to do, it's an obligation. And I think that is a key factor in modern society that, might be diminished quite a bit, but something that Stoicism was always promoted, that you have an absolute obligation to
yeah,
serve others. It's not just, I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to bow out. Um,
yeah.
I think to be a good Stoic, you have to accept that you have an obligation to do that.
Absolutely. I think, when I review these and I think through these concepts, I find myself continually coming back to the idea that um, in many cases, pushing into positions of, say, leadership or pushing into positions of control or power, right? Those that can be seen as sort of you're pushing other people down, or you're pushing to that level by on the backs of others or something like that. And the practice that you and I practice, to me, so much of it resonates with the idea that we're there to bring ourselves, all of us together, kind of forward. And so the service is not. I think it does include the kind of typical use of the word service that we have. I mean, you you were a service member yourself. I have never been in the armed forces or anything like that before, but you were, right, Mick? And so you have done service in that sort of, I don't like the word stereotypical, but in a typical way, right? That when people say service today, if someone, I always say, for example, on November 11th, I'll make sure I say to my fellow, and I know you've gotten my text messages on this, where I'll say thank you for your service, right? But there's also the service of others, of just doing things that make it better for everybody, doing things that improve the wider.
Yes, and I think that's an important point. I mean, people think of military service, and I'm, a big proponent of military service, but it's just one of many ways to serve. It's not the end all be all, and it is a job at the end of the day. I mean, it's not a volunteer. It is a volunteer to serve, at least in the U.S. military, but service should be much broader than, serving in uniform. It could be volunteering at the local shelter. It could be, getting involved in a community project to clean up the town. And there's all sorts of things. In fact, those are more in line with the service I think Zeno's actually talking about, which is directly for the benefit of others. And that's a key factor in Stoicism that should be promoted. And you don't have to be a Stoic to do this, right? Plenty of people serve others that could care less about this philosophy. But this philosophy, I think, really does promote it, and hopefully, those that follow it will exemplify that.
Yeah, so and I completely agree with that. And I think now, right, as we enter into, without anything super specific, obviously, but as we enter into how we are as citizens of our own cities and states and provinces and countries and the world, right? I think a lot of this comes down to a choice, right? You're making, and this is something that I have talked about with my other fellow Stoics, or with other people talking about this. It's a choice, right? You have to choose whether you're going to do what you can and what's best for all, right, or for a small group, right? And again, not going too deep into it, but I think right now, we as a species, almost as the human species, we are at a point where, yes, people have iPhones, and we have, like, I work with the space program, right? And we do all have some of these amazing things that I think would blow someone like Zeno away. But at the same time, when we look at something like the Republic, we have to choose, or these two republics, I should say, these two pieces of work. To me, I almost feel like we have to choose which one we think is the right one, and start thinking about how best to serve for those ideas, right? And for me, I won't pretend that I can speak for you at all, Mick, but for me, I choose as a Stoic, right, to believe in this idea that the greater the greater good of everyone around me, not just those close to me, but even perfect strangers, um, is of benefit to us as a species, as a citizenship, as a species, as a country, as a province or state or whichever wherever you live. And I think there's an interesting similarity now between what we have in the world with these sort of ideologies. I don't know, say they always conflict because they're always trying to do what's right or what they think is right, but it's more just like there are some different views right now in the world that are causing some interesting debates going on. But it's a parallel between now and back in the day, right? In um, in Greece at the time when these were being written, right? You have democratic city states like Athens, and then you have monarchic or oligarchic city states like Sparta, right? And so people are sort of choosing which direction to take their populace. So, but what's your take on that? Because ultimately, I see these two pieces of work as being just as relevant today as they would 2,500 years ago, right?
Absolutely. And just to highlight the relevance, there's a lot of discussions now and what looks like two things. One, a surge toward autocracy. And I just did a quick search, and according to Democracy Institute, around 71% of the global population, which is about 5.7 billion people, live in autocracies. That's a trend. It's going more that way and less toward progressive democracies. And if we are adherents to Zeno's republic, that's in the exact opposite direction. And I hope anybody that believes in democracy, obviously, is against this trend. And it's up to the democracies of the world, especially the strong ones like my country and your country, to defend democracies, in my opinion, especially when they're invaded by an autocracy like Russia. So that's one part that's very relevant today. And there's also the idea that countries should basically become isolationists and simply worry about themselves and not about others, whether it's humanitarian or just general economic trade. And I think that's also a trend we're seeing, which is counter to the Stoic principles espoused in Zeno's Republic and also going in the wrong direction. So I think these concepts are as relevant today as they were then, and maybe even more so.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. We have to think about these concepts and what they mean for ourselves and for our futures, right? We are in a circumstance now where we can no longer, I think of ourselves as us and the next town over. We have to widen the circle, to use sort of parallel a Stoic practice, because when I trade with a group of people that are of a lesser economic footing than me, right? By bringing them up, I believe that that's a good thing because you bring them up, it brings up everybody, right? And you sort of bring everybody up, and that's just from an economic standpoint. From just a general, democratic standpoint, if we further very positive ideas about the goodwill and benevolence towards others and magnanimity towards others, I think is a good thing, because then it will resonate around the world, sort of comes back around at you. And so I completely agree that I think with what you're saying, because it's just, it's so important that we talk about these things. Well, that's pretty heavy section of conversation there, but I think a very, very valid conversation. I've been kind of looking forward to when we were going to really get a chance to start diving into some strong topics. But I think we're going to have to wrap up there, Mick. Um, we're coming up on a good time for ourselves. So, um, if there's anything else you'd like to add,
No, I think that was. I mean, we're going to come back to this theme quite a bit.
I think so.
As you said, it's very relevant, and I think it's very important to have this discussion, especially.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we'll wrap up there, and we'll hear everybody on the next episode.
Great. Thanks, Adam. Thank you for listening to the Pup and Porch podcast. If you'd like to find out more about the podcast or its host, head over to pupandporch.com, and you can listen to all our episodes on Spotify, Apple, or whichever platform you prefer. And if you'd like to help out with the podcast, you can find us on Patreon. Drop us an email if you have a comment on any past episode, you have a suggestion for future episodes, or you have an essay on an important topic for Stoicism. Send it to us, and then we can be reached at info@pubandporch.com. Today's music was provided by bensound.com. Until next time, Pub and Porch out.